Hey everyone, welcome in. Thanks for joining me. In this episode, I'd like to discuss the importance of Lojong practice. Lojong is a Tibetan word that directly translates as mind training. And of course, mind training is all of the Buddhist path, but more specifically, what we're often referring to is transforming adversity into the path of practice, into the path of developing wisdom, compassion, and loving kindness, as well as the path of awakening. And we're also talking about transforming our view, transforming our perspective, transforming any biases and or rigidity we may hold in our ideas, beliefs, and actions. So Lojong is quite a big category. Often we think of it as slogans sometimes, like certain catchphrases to help us transform difficulties, challenging emotions throughout the day. But actually, it's a lot more than that. The Lojong tradition stems from an earlier lineage in Tibetan Buddhism called the Kadam tradition. And this is heavily influenced by Atisha Dipankara, who is one of the great Indian scholar saints who traveled from India into Tibet to help Buddhist practitioners in Tibet develop their practice. And from Atisha, one of the things he taught, one of the things he emphasized was direct Lojong practice, mind training, working with challenges, everyday challenges to practice, to life, difficult emotions, thoughts, etc. And especially those thoughts and behaviors that are stagnating our practice or taking us in a misdirection, in a direction that's not going to serve our Dharma practice as a whole. So you can go research this a little bit more on Atisha Dipankara and the sort of foundings of the tradition. And also there's some key texts to Lojong that we often work with. The 8 verses of mind training is one well-known one that I have a course on Tricycle if you want to go in depth into these teachings. As well, you can reference many texts by Atisha himself, as well as some of his main disciples, Drumtempa, Geshe Langri Tangpa, as I just mentioned, the 8 verses of mind training. And there's so many. There's actually some great volumes these days where they've put together, many Lojong texts into like a single volume. And this can be great. You can, it's translated into English if you're an English speaker, and you can read and benefit from these teachings. But today, I just want to emphasize some of the benefits and why it's important to incorporate Lojong into our practice. So I think some of it is going to be obvious already, which is, what do we face when we try to practice meditation, when we try to practice the Dharma authentically? So we face obstacles. We face all kinds of difficulties, not in just the practice itself or showing up to practice or working with, thought rumination and all the difficulties of distraction that arise, but also sort of, difficulties in afflictive emotions like excessive attachment, desire, excessive aggression sometimes, as well as just misperception where we may not fully understand what we're doing. We may have doubts about it. And all of that is actually, it's not unwelcome. It just sort of happens to me. I'm assuming it happens to most of us when we're trying to practice the traditional Buddhist path. But either way, Lojong is there for developing courage in the face of adversity. And here, more specifically, we're talking about the adversity to bodhicitta, to developing the mind of awakening, to developing loving kindness, compassion, and non-dual wisdom. So specifically, Lojong focuses on that. What are the obstacles to that and how do we remedy it? Not just on the cushion, but in daily life. How can we transform adverse experiences on the path? Like I said, obstacles, distractions, even doubts on the path. But of course, with that said, Lojong can also be used when we are just struggling with life, when we're struggling with everyday emotional challenges, running out of patience with our kids or our partner or our work, having difficulties with excessive desire that's causing behaviors that are harming ourselves and others, or excessive aggression, all of that, right? And so all of this can be brought into the path. And typically how Lojong is organized is first in equalizing oneself and others, right? And so, and I'll even give a preliminary for that in a moment. But equalizing oneself and others just really has to do with, relational activity, all of the relationships we're in, the challenges that arise in our daily life in relation to friends, family, coworkers, neighbors, just, people on the news, whatever comes up for you. And we're recognizing that fundamentally, even if we don't hold the same beliefs as someone else or the same value system, that fundamentally, when you really look at our own behavior, the behavior of others, we all want happiness and we all want to be free from suffering. Of course, there can be a major difference in how we pursue that happiness and how we pursue remedying or removing pain or dissatisfaction from our life. But either way, the foundation is there, that when you really look at people's behavior, at their conduct, at why they do what they do, if we look at why we do what we do from moment to moment, it's because we're seeking what we think is happiness and we're trying to move away from what we think is painful, dissatisfactory, or suffering. So that's food for thought. I'm not laying that on you as a spiritual trip. That's really something for you to reflect on and decide for yourself. Is that true or not? But once we establish that, then we can proceed with the practice of equalizing oneself and other, which has huge benefits. Because where does a lot of our frustration and difficulty come? Of course, it comes in difficulty with our own emotions and thoughts. And so in a moment, we'll talk about that. But it comes, it mostly comes in relation to others, in relation to situations around us, right? Like what triggers our challenging emotions has a lot to do with how others behave and act around us, whether we agree with them, whether we don't agree with them, whether they're doing something we like or dislike, all of that. So again, here, we're not trying to remove the idea that something can be more harmful or more helpful, right? So we're not trying to remove that idea. There can, on a relative level, obviously be more skillful, more constructive ways of behaving and less skillful and more harmful ways of behaving. And we can talk on that another time, what those might be. The Buddhist path actually lays those out. So the general system is avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions. The first one is taking life, because we can see nothing wants their life taken, right? So we can all agree on that as sort of a universal discipline or ethic. But anyways, not to get too much off track. So we're not using this practice of equalizing oneself and others to talk about specific behaviors necessarily. What we're looking at is the fundamental, what's behind our motivations and what's behind the motivations of others, right? Now, there can be a lot of confusion also behind those, meaning what I said is, earlier was something like, we seek what we think will provide happiness and we move away from what we think will make us suffer or cause pain. But that's not necessarily true. And so the path of Dharma is actually working through that on a personal level, gaining an understanding and then a deeper experience of what that actually is. And so we get more clear on what causes lasting happiness, lasting joy, awakening, etc., and freedom. And we remove what's actually causing suffering, where generally, in the tradition, there's many teachers who have said, generally as sentient beings, who have confusion in the mind and we get caught in our destructive emotions, we often actually turn away from happiness and turn towards suffering, not on purpose, right? Like we don't intend to do that, but that's what happens because there's confusion in the mind. So a lot of Lojong teachings are about, actually shifting that confusion. Transforming it and waking up from that confusion. And of course, equalizing oneself and others has to do with that, because when we recognize we all generally are looking for the same thing, though we may be confused by that, then what we can start to infer and what we can start to embody is a warmth and love and compassion for all beings, even those we dislike, right? Not because we agree with them or we like what they say, or we like what they believe, or we like what they do, but because we fundamentally hold them with a sense of warmth, right? So this is a tricky one. We often have to think about this. What does real compassion mean? It means being able to look at or work with someone we're having difficulty with, where we don't have to agree with them, but we can see their fundamental value. We don't undermine their fundamental value or worth, right? So equalizing oneself and others really helps with that. I did say I wanted to back up a bit in relation to this as well, which is first we need to develop equanimity, right? So equanimity is a preliminary for equalizing oneself and others, because we're not necessarily including ourselves within equanimity, though of course, indirectly we're included. But often with equanimity practice, we imagine 3 different kinds of relationships, and that can shift each practice session. Someone we like, someone we dislike, and someone we're indifferent to. And we slowly start to recognize that most of our relationships, if not all, fall into one of these 3 categories. And what we do with equanimity is we start to open up the idea that any one person in front of us, we just picked 3 figures in the beginning, but that any one person is more or less valuable. And we start to have equanimity towards them. We also start to see the holes or the faults in our beliefs around liking, disliking, or holding others in indifference. And then, of course, over time, we shift that, which is not a short, easy process. That takes quite a bit of time and work. So it's not like saying, oh, you should be equanimous and then just do it. No, it's like a training we have to engage in over quite a long period of time for most of us. Every day we put in a little bit of work on that. So anyways, just going back, because sometimes that needs to be the preliminary for then equalizing oneself and others, where we add ourselves into that mix and we start to see, yes, at a fundamental level, we all want happiness. We all want to be free from suffering. And so no one is higher or lower. And also, we're not higher or lower. We were just another being trying to live our life, trying to figure this whole thing out of what life is, right? So that's important. So that's one huge category of Lojong practice. And again, I'm just giving sort of the importance and an overview. But if you want to go into the depth of the practices on how to actually do that, like I said, any Lojong text is going to have practices and teachings on this. I already recommended the 8 verses of mind training. Again, there's so many Lojong texts that we can work with. 7-point mind training is probably one of the most widely studied ones. So you can check those out. And also there's many commentaries and modern commentaries as well. So anyways, what I was going to say next is that, so equalizing oneself and others is the first category. Then we start to move to what's called exchanging oneself and others. Now, this is when it gets, how do you say it? I would say like a little bit hardcore, in the sense that if we really take the practices seriously, it can be challenging at the beginning, or challenging for a beginner to recognize the point or what we're actually doing here. Because we're working with practices like Tonglen, which is a practice to imagine taking on the sufferings of others and giving others our own happiness, well-being, health, wealth, etc. And that's just in the beginning, that's a process of imagination, but that can trigger a lot for people, especially when we don't yet embody our own internal worth and value. So a preliminary to the preliminary, meaning like even before we do equanimity, we may want to do some work on just finding our basic okayness, or what my teacher Soknö Rinpoche calls essence love. So I'm not going to talk about that here. I do talk about that in a lot of content on my YouTube channel and podcast. So you could always go back and kind of search for that. But also I highly recommend Soknö Rinpoche's course. It's called Fully Being. And in there, he goes through sets of practices and ways of working to develop a sense of one's innate okayness, right? So if that's not there, often the Lojong practice doesn't necessarily go in the right direction, and you'll see why in a moment. So I highly recommend working with that. Then we have equanimity, which is part of the traditional Buddhist path. Then we have equalizing oneself and others. And then we have exchanging oneself and others through Tonglen and other sets of practices. So what is Tonglen and what is exchanging oneself and others? Here we're recognizing that when we put 100% of our value just in our own needs and wants and wishes, and basically in sort of this ego framework of me, I, and mine, from a Buddhist perspective, what ends up happening is it ends up causing suffering down the road. Maybe we get some temporary pleasure because of that. We get what we want. We are able to do our life in a way we want it, etc. But down the road, we're neglecting others. And so what this teaching assumes is that actually giving to others, practicing generosity, wishing others well, activating compassion with others in our life is the path to genuine, lasting happiness. And on a deeper level, helps us to, I guess you could say, like, uncontract or shift or desolidify ego clinging at the center of our universe, which, from a Buddhist perspective, is the root cause of suffering. And again, this is a big topic because when we start to desolidify ego clinging, some people wonder, well, does that mean I don't exist, or we're trying to not exist? No, we're just trying to understand what does exist and what doesn't exist. Because one of the foundational teachings of Buddhism is that there's some sort of confusion around there for us, and that is the root cause of suffering. So again, if this is interesting to you, I highly recommend going into more Buddhist studies, checking out these teachings on Buddhist non-duality, because for me, it's kind of the foundation of everything, that if that's not there, then all the Dharma ends up just sort of adorning our ego clinging and not actually interrupting it, which actually is the way we find freedom, through interrupting ego clinging, recognizing we don't have to live that way. We don't have to live in an ego-centered structure. So now exchanging oneself with others is in that context. It comes from that context of the deeper Buddhist teachings as well as its foundations. And then there's a bunch of practices for doing that. So originally, practices like Tonglen and exchanging oneself with others, they were kind of private. And what I mean by private is they were passed down from teacher to student directly, not openly taught in groups. And I think at that point, we're talking like 1,000+ years ago in Tibet and India, they were not, the teacher was kind of checking to see if the student was ready for those kinds of teachings. So nowadays, they're just available. They're public. You can find lots of public teachings on this, Dalai Lama, Pema Chodron, many teachers. And so they're there. But we have to also do our due diligence to see, like, hey, am I open to this? Am I ready to take this in the right direction, which is to desolidify any of my beliefs, reification, ideas about myself and others, right? Again, which thankfully is a slow process, so I don't want to scare you. It's not like that all happens at once, like you take, some pill and then it all happens. No, it's slow. But we have to be open to what that really is, and we have to be, somewhat ready for that. Like I said, if we're not, there's preliminaries we can work on. Like I said, developing, connecting with our own essence, love, okayness, through health human being practices found in Fully Being at fullybeing.org, through Sokni Rinpoche, as well as going into just the 4 immeasurables, which have equanimity as part of them, and loving kindness and compassion, and then equalizing oneself and others, right? So these are all ways of working to build up to exchanging oneself and others. But of course, I know a lot of people love Tonglen. It does sort of have an effect of making you feel good. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because sometimes that can just become an adornment, if you know what I mean, adornment of the ego. But if we take it in the right direction, feeling good is not a bad thing, because, compassion is an innate state. Loving kindness is innate to our mind and life. And so it's not bad to feel that. And if that's making you feel good, great. But then we want to make sure we don't just use that as like a pill to sort of only feel temporary pleasure. We want to ultimately move towards opening ourselves up, opening up the ideas, beliefs we have around others and the world. And of course, starting to soften with ourselves and others. And this helps to then connect into the wisdom teachings, which we also find in Lojong, right? So in a way, just to sum it up, Lojong is kind of the whole path, but put into packages for, let's say, a simpler structure of practice. Simplicity is deceptive because that doesn't mean easy, right? It just means like a simpler package that really anyone can understand once you know the foundations of Buddhism. You don't have to be a scholar. You don't have to be super developed as a practitioner. You can work on them. So I think that's why Lojong is really important, is any of us can do it. And it essentializes the Buddhist path of wisdom and compassion, right? Not talking too much about the wisdom teachings of Buddhism here. I did a little bit when I'm talking about ego solidification, like desolidifying that, opening up reification, shifting things. That's all inferring the wisdom teachings of Buddhism. But we can find them more directly in the Lojong teachings. And so I encourage you to go search for them there. And then, of course, having teachers, having mentors, having people to help you understand those teachings and put them into practice is vital. Because like I said, they may seem simple, but there's a lot of sidetracks, right? And we want to make sure they're not adorning our ego clinging. They're helping to actually open it up and reduce and remove it. So with that said, I hope that inspired you a little bit to practice Lojong, to incorporate it into your meditation practice. I find it's a great addition if we're already a Buddhist practitioner and we're just looking for ways to transform everyday relational activities into the path, to grow more wisdom in our daily life, to help foster compassion for ourselves and others. Lojong practices are great. If you're newer to Buddhism or sort of a secular meditator, they're also great. They can also really help you. Of course, they include some Buddhist ideals and philosophies, so it may take some time to warm up to those if you're not familiar with them. But either way, if you take a lighter approach, no big deal. You can work with them, and over time, they'll open. I hope this helped to gain some inspiration. I hope just the overview also framed kind of what it is. As I said, there's so much material on this. I also just had a course launch through Tricycle online courses, so you can go there. You can search for it. It's called, I think it's just called Lojong Mind Training is the title. But if you just search my name, Scott Tusa, in the course, you'll find it. And in there, I go into detail in these practices as well as the 8 verses of mind training text. And so hopefully that can be some support to you. But as I said, there's so many good books and courses and teachings out there. So I wish you luck on your Lojong journey. Thanks so much.